Hello, everyone, and welcome to Dr. Deep State. We have a very special guest again on today, and his name is Father Donald Noiseux, and I will from here on out refer to him as Father Donald. And we are revisiting the topic of the Fatima Enigma. And Father, I'd just like to say hello to you, and I think you'd like to read something for us as an introduction.
Thank you, Dr. Hagen. It's always a good thing to start with our Blessed Mother because Christ came through her by his own choice, and so he wants us to return to him by Our Lady's intercession as well. Our Lady's birthday is celebrated liturgically on the 8th of September. That day is soon arriving. There's a customary novena, which I think would start on the 31st of August, but this is a lovely prayer to the Child Mary as popularized in Milan, Italy. And I'll read this prayer to you and just say a little bit about this particular devotion. The prayer to Maria Bambina. Sweet child Mary, destined to be the mother of God and our sovereign and loving mother, by the prodigies of grace you lavish upon us, mercifully listen to my humble supplications and the needs which press upon me from every side, and especially in my present tribulation. I place all my trust in you. O Holy Child, by the privileges granted you alone, and by the merits which you have acquired, be merciful to me this day. Show that the source of spiritual favors and the continuous benefits which you dispense are inexhaustible, because your power with the heart of God is unlimited. Deign, through the immense profusion of graces with which the Most High has enriched you from the first moment of your immaculate conception, grant me, O celestial child, my petitions, and I shall eternally praise the goodness of your heart. Amen. Just a little bit of background on this devotion to Our Lady Maria Bambina. In the Middle Ages, it was customary as a practice to make little waxen images of our Blessed Lord and Our Lady. And in Italy, there had been such a waxen image of the Blessed Virgin as a child that was venerated in Milan, but because of age, the statue had somewhat yellowed and was no longer in the best of repair. So one night in 1884, one of the sisters at the convent was very ill, and she requested from the Mother Superior that the sick sister be allowed to have the image of Maria Bambina in her room. She was in terrible pain, the suffering sister. So the Superior consented, and the sister who had been sick was completely cured. But even more amazingly, the waxen image was also restored to a condition as if it were new. And from that time on, the veneration of the Maria Bambina grew. Pope Pius X, St. Pope Pius X, encouraged this devotion. Pope John Paul II himself had visited the convent in Milan and commented that this was a devotion that wasn't well enough known. But there's a marvelous little picture, which I had seen at one time, a painting, and I wish I could find it again. It was an image of the child Mary in her crib, and there was a snake slithering around on the ground, and the rocking motion of the little crib that had rockers on it, a little wooden crib, crushed the head of the serpent, as if to say, even in her holy infancy, Our Lady already had that power over the serpent. And so it calls to mind that theme that you develop of those enmities which go down and align from the beginning of time. So there are some who don't feel happy about the idea that God has lavished Our Lady with these graces, but that's the way that he chose to have it. And that's the way, as faithful children of God, that we also have to accept it as well. So we give praise to Our Lady because God has entrusted to her that power of crushing the serpent. Just as a very quick recap of some of the things I said last time, we might recall that in the Old Testament, in the book of Judith and in the book of Judges, there are 3 instances described where women crush the heads of the adversaries of God. These are types, prefigurations of Our Lady. And so if the prefigurations show women crushing the head of the enemies of God, how much more fitting would it be that Our Lady, who is the fulfillment of these types, would also be the one to crush the head of the evil serpent. So that is a consolation for us to know that in her humility, God has entrusted this victory to her. So the last time we had used the title, The Enigma of Fatima, and in going back, I thought on some occasions I was not as clear with this title as I might have been. It calls to mind the observation of Winston Churchill. I think that it was in 1939 on a radio speech that Winston Churchill coined that famous expression, Russia is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. Russia, a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. So we see that these three words, riddle, mystery, and enigma, represent basically the same thing, something very difficult sometimes to figure out. And so I think we could even apply this image of Russia to the mystery of Fatima. Fatima seems to be, from our perspective, a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. Why would I say that? Because our Lord told us, when you mean yes, say yes. When you mean no, say no. Everything else is from the evil one. And so Our Lady, is the perfect disciple of Christ, would have followed our Lord's teachings to the letter. And yet it seems as if Fatima has become a confused mishmash of contradictions and confusions throughout the years. So again, we might remember that our Lord himself had mentioned that he would teach in parables, because you have eyes and you do not see, you have ears and you do not hear. So part of it, I think, part of the confusion, the contradiction, the mystery of Fatima can be explained by one little sentence that Our Lady explained to the children in August of 1917. You might remember the children had agreed to come to the Cova on the 13th of each month. Our Lady first appeared in May. Her last appearance with the Miracle of the Sun was in October. But in August, the children were not able to show up for their appointment because they had been kidnapped by the administrator of the town. So a few days later, Our Lady appeared to them in a location not all that far from their houses. And Our Lady said to them, the miracle would have been greater had you not been taken to the village. The administrator of the town had kidnapped the three children. He had taken them to the village of Oreim, and because of that, they were not able to be at the Cova as they had wanted to be. And so how mysterious these words of Our Lady. The miracle of the sun was not as great as it would have otherwise been, for the fact that the children were impeded from arriving because of the machinations of that one man, the administrator of the town. So here's the thing. This was during World War I. There were thousands and thousands of crimes being committed all over Europe, but it was for none of these that the miracle was going to be of lesser grandeur, but rather it was going to be because of the sin of the administrator, because he was directly involved in this scenario, in this whole unfolding event. So it's as if to say that people who have positions to be favoring the unfolding of Fatima or impeding it somehow can cause events to proceed in a rocky and bumpy way. So in other words, the short of it all is, I think all of this confusion is possible because of sin, because of hardness of heart, because of the deficiencies of many of the pastors in the church, including priests, bishops, cardinals, and even popes, perhaps, who have not been as responsive to the requests as heaven as otherwise might have been. So we notice that in conjunction with all of this, a great area of confusion has to do with the words of the Blessed Mother when she said in July of 1917, after the vision of hell, to forestall this, the punishment. Let me go back a little bit more. She describes an event that will presage World War II, that great light which appeared in the sky, as we find out later in January of 1938. But if Our Lady tells us, if my requests are heeded, Russia will be converted and there will be peace. If not, she shall spread her errors throughout the world, promoting wars and persecutions of the church. The good will be martyred. The Holy Father will have much to suffer. Various nations will be annihilated. Okay, let me look at that one more time. If my requests for the consecration of Russia are made, there will be peace. If not, she shall spread her errors throughout the world, promoting wars and persecutions of the church, etc. Here is another enigmatic part of the message. What are the errors of Russia? Now, Hugh Owens, who is a wonderful speaker at the Colby Center, actually, I think he might be the founder of the Colby Center, has a wonderful lecture. It's about an hour long where he speaks about evolutionism. And of course, the whole mission of the Colby Center is to point out quite clearly that evolutionism is ridiculous. But according to Hugh Owens, he thinks of evolutionism as one of the great errors of Russia, because this was one of the teachings of the communists. Then we have communism as the usual suspect that's brought forth most frequently. But interestingly, Bishop Fulton Sheen, who was an expert on communism and who had studied Russian history and knew so much about this topic, pointed out quite clearly that communism was not indigenous to Russia, but that it was an error that had come from the West. I wondered too about the prospect of orthodoxy, because we see that in the Fatima message, it's very clear, as I'll get to in a moment, a great import of the message has to do with the role of the papacy, the indispensable role of the papacy in the church that Christ founded. So orthodoxy denies the papacy or the supremacy of the supreme pontiff, and also orthodoxy, interestingly as well, denies, at least officially, the Immaculate Conception of our Blessed Mother. And it was for this denial that Our Lady had, amongst other offenses against her, requested the reparation communions for the 5 First Saturdays. But also, I was listening to an interview, or a conference, I should say, by Carlos Becerra. I don't know if I mentioned him before in the previous talk, but Carlos Becerra reminds me, at least from what I've heard of you so far, being somewhat of a new viewer for the last 4 weeks or so, and having listened to Carlos Becerra for a few years, he reminds me in a certain sense of the Dr. Hagen of Brazil, because he has zeroed in on exactly your thesis, which has to do with that whole conflict between a certain group of people from the beginning and our Lord and the church which he established. So it was through Carlos Becerra about 2 weeks ago that I learned of a 5 or 6 part series that was posted on LifeSite News that's quite comprehensive and speaks of the Noahide laws and that kind of thing. But in discussing this posting from LifeSite News, Carlos Becerra referred to the errors of Russia as being something directly related to the same group that has been discussed. And so that's something that, as a matter of fact, he had a more specific application of that, and I'd have to go back and listen to the video again. But that would make sense too in light of Our Lady's comments on the 13th of July, 1917, because if we look behind the scenes of the First World War, the Second World War, so many other events that have unfolded, including the rise of Protestantism and so forth, we see that all of these groups had certain helpers assisting them, if you will, behind the scenes, acting as agitators and using these forces as kind of stage props or puppets even to promote their agenda. So I think there's more to the errors of Russia than merely communism, because the picture is deeper than that. And maybe for some reason, as I think indicated when we spoke last time, that could well have been something more specifically mentioned in the unrevealed part of the third secret. But I'll go on to some other considerations regarding the confusion of Fatima, but I didn't know if you had something that you would want to interject at this point.
I'm going to let you continue, Father.
One of the comments that had been on our conversation on YouTube the last time we had spoken together was a reference to the impostor, Sister Lucy. And you and our conversation together had alluded to it very, very obliquely with the word fake. And at the time, I remember thinking, yeah, this is something really important, but I wasn't sure how our time considerations were going and so forth. But I listened to the 3 recent talks that you gave on a book by Father Chazelle. And it seems to me that it was in the last of these episodes that you made reference to the fact that the bigger the lie, the more weight it would have, or the more audacious the lie was, the more power that would have in deceiving people. And when you said this, I thought exactly of the Sister Lucy scenario, but in order to put it into a clearer context for me, as I mentioned the last time, I'm old. So I remember a lot of these things from firsthand experience. So let me describe what I clearly remember as my reaction to Sister Lucy at Fatima in 1967 for the 50th anniversary of the apparitions when Pope Paul VI was there. Now remember, 1967, no internet. The Telstar communications satellite had been launched in 1962, if my memory serves me correctly. So even these overseas transmissions were rare. There weren't that many satellites up in the air. And so something like this didn't have the wide coverage that it would have had later on. However, because I had been interested in Fatima since I was 10, learning that Sister Lucy was going to be at Fatima was a very big deal. And I can't remember how it was or where it was that I first saw the photographs of Sister Lucy with Pope Paul VI. And I remember clearly, though, when seeing them, however that might have been, my first reaction was, that's not Sister Lucy. It doesn't look anything like her. And besides, she's much too young looking. However, it was inconceivable to me that it would have been possible for some impostor to show up that day. So because that experience is so alien to our sensibilities, we mold our mind in order to fit the narrative that is put before us. Now, I'll get to some scenarios about that a little bit later. But so as to keep on this track for now, my first response was that can't be Sister Lucy, because remember, again, that was the first photograph of the impostor Sister Lucy that we had seen. Subsequent to that, there would be many others. So it was that one photograph or two compared to the several photographs that we would have seen of the pre-1960 Sister Lucy. And her demeanor was quite different. I hope I can remember to keep all these threads together, but this might be a good time to make reference to a man who I saw on YouTube, a fascinating story of a gentleman who knew that he had been adopted. And he was he was very happy with his adopted family, but as is often the case, he wanted to know more about his biological family. So he went on the internet. This man's name was Steve Carter. You can look him up, Steve Carter. And he was amazed to find a photograph of him at 26 years of age. He was about 34 when he started looking for his biological parents. And he sees his own picture, his own photograph as a 26-year-old. But that photograph that he saw was computer generated by software, which took an image of him as a 5-month-old baby. They took a picture of this 5-month-old baby, and with the computer software projected how he would look at 26, and it was startlingly similar. So it was because of this that he was able to find out about his identity ultimately. The point of it all is that we had seen pictures of Sister Lucy, perhaps when she was, in the 50s, she would have been 40. And her youthfulness. She looked older at that age than she did when she came out on the Esplanade at Fatima. But there's even more to it than that, because there are computer-generated images of how Sister Lucy would look at age 60, based upon some of the older photographs of her when she was perhaps 40ish. And there's really no comparison between these computer-generated images of Sister Lucy as she would look at age 60 and the way that she actually did look when she appeared at Fatima. So if a computer software program was able to be so accurate in projecting how this man would look at age 26 based on his photograph from 5 months, it would be less of a jump for the computer software to predict how Sister Lucy would look at age 60 based on how she looked at age 40. But that's only one of the components. So for years, I expected that must have been the real Sister Lucy. But as time went on, more people started to speak about this, especially in the last 10 or 15 years. And amongst the first, to my recollection, to come out with a study on this were the Diamond brothers, who, as you know, are sedevacantists. But again, people should not dismiss the information that people gathered because they disagree with their perspective on this important matter. But the series that the Diamond brothers put together was very, very well done and very convincing. And it also explained many of the other particulars that we can talk a little bit about as to how it is that family members and such could have been fooled by this. But in addition to that, Carlos Becerra, who I mentioned, also has different but not contradictory indications as to how this might have been. So before continuing a little bit, I had another experience that helped me to recognize how fragile we are in our sensibilities, our perceptions. About 25 years ago, less than that, about 20 years ago, I saw this movie that I rented called 61, the number 61. And the movie is based on the year 1961, when the two big Yankee stars, Roger Maris and Mickey Mantle, were competing with one another to see who would be the first of the players to hit 61 home runs. So the title has that double meaning, the year 1961, the 61 home runs. So the movie was quite compelling. And of course, I had remembered Roger Maris and Mickey Mantle from my childhood because they were very, very big stars, very, very big personalities. But I hadn't seen their pictures in a long, long time. So after I watched this movie, which really was quite engrossing, I thought, well, I'll check them out on YouTube and see some footage of the actual Roger Maris and Mickey Mantle. And I remember my response was really strange, because for a minute it was as if the Roger Maris and Mickey Mantle in the film seemed more like Roger Maris and Mickey Mantle than the actual videos of them that were true. And that made me appreciate how easily manipulated our sensibilities can be, because I knew clearly, yes, these are two actors playing a part. The others are actually filmed of the individuals themselves. But to me, that was a big clue as to how easily manipulated our impressions and our understandings and interpretations could be. Because in this case, I hadn't seen any pictures to my recollection of these two famous individuals for years. And if I had never been able to go back to those earlier pictures, then in my mind, the movie actors would have substituted for the reality. And so similarly, I think for family members of Sister Lucy, where photographs would have been rare, before getting to that part, let's just backtrack a little bit to go about some other studies. I mentioned the Diamond brothers. I'll come up with them again because they explain how it was in the cloisters of those days, the Carmelite cloister in particular, where if you were to visit a family member, the sister would be wearing a veil over her face. She would have been behind the grill with a curtain covering the grill from the sister's side. And in addition, there were also like spikes that protruded from the grill so that the person on the other side could not get their face too close. So it would have been difficult to have a real clear vision of the individual that you were visiting. But we can continue to that a little bit. There are many, many other factors that Dr. Peter Hanowski came up with. Dr. Peter Hanowski has a website, Sister Lucy Truth, and on that website he posts a lot of information. He has enlisted all kinds of, I use the word scientist here in a legitimate sense, because facial recognition technology is quite a real thing. As a matter of fact, my first experience with it was just a week ago when I visited someone at a nursing home, and I had to register using facial recognition technology. So I had to go up to this little device. It took my picture, and then I entered the information as to my name and who I was visiting. So subsequently, when I went back to visit again, I just went over to that little thing, and it recognized who I was immediately, and information came up. So this facial recognition technology is based on all kinds of mathematical formulas about the distance between the eyes and the distance between the mouth and all the body parts, etc. So Dr. Hanowski has done a lot of work in various areas to verify without any doubt that the Sister Lucy who appeared at Fatima in 1967 was not the same Sister Lucy. But forgive me for jumping back and forth, but this is a very important consideration which relates to the reactions that Dr. Hanowski sometimes could get from skeptics. I had watched this man on YouTube several times. He has a channel called The Wings of Pegasus. He's a musician. He's a real gentleman. He's always benevolent and kind and calm. And he analyzes people's performances using computer software to demonstrate especially something called pitch control, which is becoming very, very typical today, where after a recording is made, the studio will correct imperfections in their pitch. And if they carry this to the nth degree, it can sound perhaps very artificial. So this gentleman who has the site, The Wings of Pegasus, had done a program on Celine Dion's performance at the Paris Olympics of not too long ago. And this gentleman said that it is not possible to use pitch control during a live performance because it's too probable that there could be glitches and the performance would be really badly distorted. So the point he was getting to is this. There's no way that Celine Dion actually sang that song. She was singing a famous Edith Piaf song, that famous French singer. It had to have been doctored up in the studio and then presented as if it were live. And I had not realized, this gentleman explained today, to be considered a live performance, all you have to do is show up on the stage and move around. That's called a live performance, because they very well might pipe in a pre-recorded performance. So here's the point I'm getting to. I had never seen this man agitated before. He was always as calm as a cucumber, as the saying goes. But this time he was really vehemently having to defend himself because so many people canceled their subscriptions, claimed they would not listen to him any longer. Why? Because he showed clearly that Celine Dion had not given an actual performance, but it was something doctored and prepared in advance and presented as if it were a live performance. And these fans were so angry at that. So he said, look, all this is available for anyone to do on their own. Do it yourself and see that I'm right. We have to be honest about these things. So here's the point. If people can be really furious because he's maintaining that a performer lip synced rather than singing live at the performance, how much more angry do people get if you say to them that this woman who publicly has been paraded as Sister Lucy since 1967 is not really Sister Lucy? People have a certain veneration to her as they perceive her. and it's going to make them very angry. So again, getting back to Dr. Hanowski, he went through many different factors to explain more proof as to how it is that we have a false Sister Lucy that's been presented. One of the most fascinating involves the fact that there are actually 2 motion pictures of the authentic Sister Lucy taken at Fatima in 1946, and a second of the impostor Sister Lucy, perhaps taken sometimes in the 80s. I don't remember the exact date. But here's the thing. In 1946, Sister Lucy of Fatima, the authentic Sister Lucy, had not yet entered the Carmelite convent. She was a Dorothean sister. So she paid a visit to her childhood home, and behind her childhood home is a well where the angel of Portugal appeared for the second apparition in the summer of 1916. So Sister Lucy went to the well, and she took a cabbage leaf, and they rolled that up. It was the custom, and she took some water from the well, drinking it through this cabbage leaf, but she used her left hand for this. So later on, the second Sister Lucy, the impostor as we would call her, is shown visiting the same well behind the same house, and she is drinking from the same well using her right hand. So yes, of course, people could make claims, maybe she was ambidextrous and so forth, but that's one piece of evidence amongst many. So we might notice too, the linguistics. Carlos Becerra, based on a long series of interviews that were done with the second Sister Lucy, with the interviewer doing the translating was Carlos Avarista. And there were much footage of Sister Lucy too speaking. And so a linguist examined the conversation and determined that the accent of the impostor Sister Lucy was not that of a native speaker of the Fatima region, but most probably further north, perhaps up in Coimbra, which ultimately is where Sister Lucy ended up in the convent. But as we know, people often never lose their childhood accents. We know of people who have come from Ireland and stayed in the States for years, and that particular designation still remains. So that's yet another fact. The first Sister Lucy had a lazy eye, as we call it, and the second Sister Lucy did not. Then Dr. Hanowski hired handwriting analysts, and they determined that the handwriting of letters appropriated to Sister Lucy, which were written by the second Sister Lucy, were different in handwriting than the first Sister Lucy. Then there was a lady who had the ability, I think her name was Lois Gibson. She had worked for police departments and was responsible for helping in hundreds of cases. This isn't a psychic. She had that ability to be able to recognize people by their facial appearances. And just based on looking at them, she could see the resemblances and the differences. And she also was clearly of the opinion that the two Sister Lucys were different. But also, an even more telling and disturbing aspect is the deportment of the second Sister Lucy. Now, the second Sister Lucy's smile, interestingly enough, too, has a tendency to go downward at each side, the left and the right side, whereas the first Sister Lucy, when smiling, has her smile going upward. And these are distinctions that do not change with age. They are distinctions which are usually related to the makeup of our whole organism. But in regards to the second Sister Lucy's deportment, we see that she's very jovial, very silly even, whereas the first Sister Lucy always had a very serious gravitas. There's a famous picture of her with Father Fuentes, who was the postulator for the cause of Francisco and Jacinta. And they're standing a few feet apart, and Sister Lucy is always very stern, as is the case with those childhood pictures of her. But when Sister Lucy too which explained about the big pictures that they were going to be displaying at the Basilica of Fatima in honor of the beatification of the two children, Francisco and Jacinta. She was told that these pictures would be 10 meters high. And Sister Lucy said, 10 meters high? And the bishop said, 10. And Sister Lucy responded by saying the holy name of Jesus as an expletive, which is something that the real Sister Lucy would never have done. We see another case when Sister Lucy II is receiving Holy Communion from Pope John Paul II. It seems as if, this is on video footage, it seems as if she is going to receive in her hand, and then he goes to put the Holy Communion in her tongue, and she receives in her tongue, and immediately after receiving Holy Communion, she grabs his hand and kisses it. Now, this is the Sister Lucy that received Holy Communion from an angel, the Sister Lucy who saw a vision of hell, the Sister Lucy who saw the sadness of Our Lady. Her deportment doesn't add up. And then there are some books that were written by the impostor Sister Lucy called Calls of Our Lady of Fatima, something of that nature. And again, it very much conveys the whole Vatican II universalistic approach. It's a different theology, a different perspective entirely. So when you put all of those elements together, the story is quite definitive. As a matter of fact, I think it was shortly before or after that you and I had the occasion to talk. It was sometime during this last summer of 2024 that the Fatima Center, which has always been middle of the road because this stuff is very politically charged, and if you want to keep your donor base going, you cannot displease people, as we found out with that gentleman who had the YouTube channel, and just for his saying that Celine Dion's performance wasn't given that day, people were non-subscribing. So the Fatima Center really had to come out. They were forced, if you will, by the evidence to say the Sister Lucy that appeared from 1967 onward was not the true Sister Lucy. That was kind of a big victory for Dr. Hanowski and the Fatima Truth Center, because the evidence was overwhelming. There was no other way around it. Now, getting back to Carlos Bezerra, the Brazilian historian and philosopher, is publishing a book very soon where he is taking his perspective on a lot of this. And at this point, he and Dr. Hanowski disagree. They completely are in agreement, no question at all, that there was a false impostor Sister Lucy. But Dr. Bezerra now is trying to figure out what could have happened, how it could have happened. And at this point, if I'm reading Dr. Hanowski correctly, he wants first to identify that a crime has been committed and then to move on from there once there is an acknowledgement of it. But a crime has been committed, yes. But remember I mentioned a moment ago, Carlos Evarista, who did that 3-hour translating interview with some bishop and Sister Lucy II. I say Sister Lucy II, meaning the impostor Sister Lucy. After Carlos Bezerra had this interview, he thought, that cannot be Sister Lucy. He went to the police, and the police put him in contact with a gentleman who, as it turns out, I think his name was Dr. Zuckerby. But there's some reason that Dr. Zuckerby was on the side of events which would provide for maintaining the fabrication that Sister Lucy II, the imposter, was the actual Sister Lucy. So the point I'm making here is that Carlos Evarista himself was confused, thinking this certainly cannot be the authentic Sister Lucy. So getting back to Carlos Bezerra, he has identified, not alone, but with the help of others, and especially including Dr. Hanowski, the fact that, yes, there was an imposter. So now we get into some fascinating areas, which I'll only touch upon a little, because if someone wants more of it, they could try using the auto-translate feature of Dr. Bezerra's videos, and especially the one where he talks specifically about this topic. And if they know Portuguese, they'll be very, very well able to understand him. But 1946 is a very interesting year. And to come right up front with it from the beginning, Carlos Becerra strongly suspects that Monsignor Escriva, the founder of Opus Dei, was involved in this program to some degree. But it might not seem, according to Carlos Becerra, exactly what you would think it could be, because it's not necessarily something that was hatched from whole cloth as a plot. I'll explain as we go along with that. Getting back to Monsignor Escriva, in the mid-40s, Opus Dei had been well established in Spain. And Monsignor Escriva's first name, I'm trying to think of it, the founder of Opus Dei, wanted Opus Dei to be expanding into Portugal. And at that time, many people don't realize the Carmelite convent that Sister Lucy entered in 1948 had been decommissioned at the time of the Portuguese upheaval and the destruction of the monarchy at the end of the 1800s, the beginning of the 1900s, so that it was no longer operating because of the anti-Catholic government, Masonic government that had been enforced in Portugal. It was completely unused except during the time of Salazar, who was very friendly to the Catholic Church. For a time, the Carmelite convent was used as an army barracks. And then around 1946, it was recommissioned, and it was starting once more operating as a Carmelite convent. And it was during this time that Monsignor Escriva came to Portugal in an attempt to have Opus Dei spread in that country. And according to Dr. Becerra, one of his strategies would be to enlist the assistance of Sister Lucy because of her great influence in Portugal and because of the fact that she was generally regarded by the Portuguese as a saint. So if Escriva could get Sister Lucy as an advocate for the cause, he would go far. So according to Carlos Becerra again, and I don't think I'm misquoting him in any way, Sister Lucy had hoped perhaps to enter the Carmel at Porto, which is a city further north in Portugal. And maybe even Fatima, though that was the last of her choices because it would have been too close to home. And one of the reasons especially that she wanted to be a cloistered Carmelite was because of the anonymity and the hiddenness. And perhaps her interest in this was stimulated by the last vision of Our Lady at Fatima in October 1917, when Our Lady appeared as Our Lady of Mount Carmel and held up the scapular. So this had been gestating in Sister Lucy's soul for some time, and she had even made requests and they were denied. But interestingly, Cardinal Montini figures into all of this because Cardinal Montini was a friend of Monsignor Escriva, and Cardinal Montini, the future Pope Paul VI, was very much disposed to some of the ideas, the theological, political, sociological ideas of Monsignor Escriva. So finally, because of Montini's permission, the permission of Pope Pius XII, which came via the Secretary of State, Cardinal Montini, then actually he would not have been Cardinal Montini. I've been misspeaking because Pius XII, as an important sidebar to this, exiled, he promoted Montini upward to Milan because Pius XII had discovered that Montini had disobeyed Pius XII's instructions, and he was negotiating with the Soviets behind the back of Pius XII. So he promoted him to Milan, and that way he would be out of the running for being a potential pope. But the very first thing that Pope John the 23rd did was to make Montini a cardinal. So that's kind of a sidebar. But we see that Montini, Monsignor Escriva, and Montini, the future pious Paul VI, was involved with, as Secretary of State, getting permission for Sister Lucy to enter the Carmel, and then especially the Carmel in Coimbra, which was being reconstituted. And interestingly, too, the Carmel at Coimbra, the sisters became cooperators with Opus Dei. So here's the theory of Carlos Becerra, which he clearly indicates as a theory. And I don't think that Dr. Hanowski is inclined to agree with going into theories that have no substantial foundation to them. But Dr. Becerra is thinking, well, we've got to start someplace. He takes the picture, the puzzle pieces, he has to put them together. So just to get to the end of this segment, Carlos Becerra said that Monsignor Escriva had visited Sister Lucy shortly before the scheduled visit of Pope Paul VI to Fatima to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the first apparition in May 1917. Now we're May 1967. And here's the theory Carlos Becerra has. The Pope very much wanted, Paul VI, very much wanted Sister Lucy to appear with him in Fatima because her presence would be a kind of seal of approval of all of these post-conciliar things. Now remember, the new Mass had not yet been implemented, but there were a lot of changes that were quickly being made. The Mass was being experimented with, and as we mentioned the last time, I think it's very, very probable, as the evidence suggests, that the part of the secret that wasn't revealed very well referred to a bad Mass and a bad Consul, bad in the sense of lacking some good. And Pope Paul VI, by having Sister Lucy there with him, would be buoyed up because her presence would be automatically giving approval to what he had done or been doing. So here's the theory of Carlos Becerra. The bishop came to Sister Lucy and said, the Pope would like you to be with him at Fatima. And she refused, according to this theory. And so again, they tried to get Monsignor Escriva to reason with her, and she refused, according to this theory. So finally, because Sister, and that seems difficult to imagine because we know that a sister would have been extremely docile, especially to the supreme authority of the church. But at the same time, if Sister Lucy was well aware of the secret of Fatima and the events that were unfolding before her eyes, she might have perceived what was going on and chose not to want to have anything to do with it. So as an emergency, according to this theory of Carlos Becerra, they had this impostor go out on the public appearance with Paul VI on that day, expecting perhaps this would be her one and only appearance. Now, here's another point that Carlos Becerra makes to show how it could have been that the family wasn't disturbed by this, because it was already authenticated or proven or demonstrated that there had been more than one attempt on the life of Sister Lucy. For example, I didn't know they had plastic explosives then. I don't know what kind of mechanism it would have been, but in one time she had received a letter, and luckily she opened the letter from the bottom with a letter opener instead of from the top. And it turned out there was some kind of explosive in that letter, so that if she had opened it from the top, she could have very well been killed. And there were attempts to poison her and so forth. So the authorities could have said to Sister Lucy's family, who already knew the danger that Sister Lucy had been in from her childhood, the authorities could have said to the family, well, you know, because we're worried about the safety of Sister Lucy, we're going to have someone go in her stead for this, because it'll be very public, and this way she'll be safe. And possibly the family could have said, oh, okay, we can understand certainly why you would do such a thing. The next time that another Sister Lucy was to be seen was when Pope John Paul II went to Fatima in May of 1982. So 1967 to 1982, and then again, another Sister Lucy had to be taken out or brought out, However, I'm going to stop here because about this part of the topic, because there are also people with some degree of evidence speculate that the authentic Sister Lucy might have died much earlier. Carlos Becerra imagines the possibility of the fake Sister Lucy existing and overlapping in time with the impostor Sister Lucy. All of that gets complicated. It's, as they say, the rabbit hole. But the bottom line of it all, between all of the investigators, is it is proven definitively that the Sister Lucy that appeared at Fatima with Paul VI was not the same Sister Lucy. Dr. Hanowski even shows, you can see it quite readily on his website, how they literally used a primitive, before the Photoshop of the computer, they used a literal cut and paste. He has provided, Dr. Hanowski, the origin photographs and the doctored photographs, which are clearly shown to be someone cutting out from a newspaper or photograph a picture of Sister Lucy and pasting it on a photograph of Pope Paul VI near a crowd. And it seems to me there was like a big television camera or something behind the place where they pasted the second Sister Lucy. It's amazing. You can even see at the fingers of the Sister Lucy imposter how when they cut it out, they weren't all that careful with their little pair of scissors, and you can see it's a literal cutout job. It's amazing. So there is so much evidence to point to the fact that there was a fake Sister Lucy. But why? Well, it's quite clear, because the real Sister Lucy knew the totality of this secret, and she was insistent upon the importance of it. And in order to prevent that, there had to be another Sister Lucy. How it started, whether or not it was planned from the beginning or it was organically unfolding, as Carlos Becerra postulated, we don't know. But a good starting point is that there was a fake. And here's the thing. People are so overwhelmed now with lies and falsities that they're numb. And the devil is very clever. I don't know if you remember the false apparitions of Bayside, New York from the 60s. You weren't Catholic until recently, so you wouldn't have followed that, and it didn't have the same amount of publicity. But on the New York World's Fairgrounds of the 1964-65 World's Fair, there were apparitions, allegedly, of Our Lady to Veronica Lucan, who subsequently was proven to be a false, a hoax, really dark things involved. But one of the things that Veronica Lucan had claimed, was that Our Lady told her that there was an impostor, Paul VI. Okay, so the thing is, that becomes a joke. And as a matter of fact, E. Michael Jones, when asked on a live podcast about a year ago about a fake Sister Lucy, unfortunately, the questioner was not specific. They said, what do you think of a fake Sister Lucy? And obviously, E. Michael Jones had not heard of all the things I just mentioned, because he dismissed it as a ridiculous travesty. Oh yeah, like the fake Paul VI. So the devil can wear people out by putting up all of these phony conspiracy theories, so that when an actual event along similar lines happens, it gets lumped in the same category, and it makes it very, very, very difficult for people to accept even the strongest of evidence. So all of this business with Sister Lucy, isn't it kind of similar in a way to all of that health emergency of 2020? People believe certain things because it's convenient, and then they're disinclined to believe other things. So moving on toward the whole mystery and enigma of Fatima again, an essential part of the message of Fatima that's right there in front of our eyes, it's crystal clear, that we oftentimes can overlook, is the Blessed Mother is making a clear reference to the role of the papacy and the essential importance that it has in the life of the church. And I think it is because of this that Our Lady said, She wants the Holy Father, in union with the bishops of the world, to consecrate Russia to her Immaculate Heart, because it will be a demonstration of the truth of the Catholic Church, headed by the successor of Peter, who has been given this power by heaven. I think that a very big mistake people make is to de-supernaturalize the Fatima message. And in this, I would use Robert Sungenis, who I have great esteem for, because it's thanks to Robert Sungenis that I became really familiar with the geocentric question, which is another subject. But Dr. Sungenis really did his research and made good information available. So in this, Dr. Sungenis has a completely supernatural perspective about the creation of the universe, in the same way that the Colby Center has a completely supernatural perspective about the creation of the universe. In other words, it is never, ever going to be possible for science to explain how the universe was created, because it was not a natural event. It was a supernatural event coming directly from the power of God. God said it, and it happened. So Dr. Sungenis clearly and correctly understands that the creation of the universe was of supernatural origin. But on the other hand, although he believes clearly in the miracle of the Son, I think it seems as if he is de-supernaturalizing Fatima, because Dr. Sungenis, about a year or so ago, maybe more by now, the time goes by so quickly, claimed that Pope Pius XII, I think I might have alluded to this in one of our previous talks, in his consecration to the world, had successfully accomplished what Our Lady was looking for, and that this consecration was accepted by heaven. But the point I made before, and that I would make over and over and over again, since the time of Pius XII, who said that the greatest sin of the 20th century was the loss of the sense of sin, we see that since the 50s onward, sin has been escalating like the proverbial snowball rolling down a hill. Sin is getting more and more expansive. No one is being spared of it. So none of these consecrations have resulted in more honor and glory being brought to God. The collapse of the Soviet Union is nothing. It's nothing at all when God's holy law inscribed in our hearts is being trampled upon. So when the consecration is legitimately done, it will have to result in a clear, almost immediate, amazing change in hearts. I think even more marvelous in Guadalupe, because when Our Lady appeared at Guadalupe in 1531, in a short time, there were 9 million conversions to the Catholic faith. I think there were like 1 million a year. The priests couldn't baptize fast enough for all the people being instructed and informed. So similarly, when the consecration of Russia happens, it will be a stupendous event. Now, I've been trying to think of the name of the privately published book I read about 10 years ago, and I had corresponded with the author by email, and he had even asked me if I would do a book review for him, and they published it in Catholic Family News. It was a wonderful book, and getting old, my mind is starting to lose my recollection of certain things, but it'll come to me eventually. But this gentleman had a very interesting scenario as to how the consecration of Russia would take place. And it makes sense to me, because it would involve a small remnant. And here's the point that can be amplified by an observation of Malachi Martin. Once again, no matter who we speak of, we have dark sides and light sides. And I know how Malachi Martin is controversial, but what I'm going to quote from him here is right on target. Bernard Jansen had asked him probably 30 years ago in one of his interviews, why doesn't John Paul II just fire some of these bishops? And of course, we know that JP2 was responsible for appointing some bad bishops, more than a few. But Malachi Martin said to Bernard Jansen, Bernard, if he were to get rid of Bishop A, there are as many bad bishops waiting to come up in the line. Every Catholic institution in the world is permeated by apostasy and modernism. Every parish, every college, every diocese. The Pope himself can't restore that. Even if you were to have St. Peter come back from heaven and reign in the Vatican today, humanly speaking, he would be incapable of changing things because the entire structure has been permeated with apostasy and error. So, in this scenario, getting back to the scenario I referenced with the book by this privately published book, which was quite compelling, there is some kind of conflagration, and the Pope might be elected by a small group of cardinals, if memory serves me correctly, and then that Pope, with a very small group of cardinals, makes the consecration of Russia, and it has its impact because it's the legitimate Pope with the legitimate cardinals. So that Don Minutella, who I mentioned to you on another program, maybe the locals' conclusion to the Fatima Enigma first version we did, Don Minutella was excommunicated for saying that Pope Benedict XVI remained the valid Pope because he had not resigned validly the papal munus. But Don Minutella has this notion that Our Lady is holding the papal munus. So here we come now to the very end of everything, meaning the end of time. My personal opinion, and I might have alluded to this before, is that somehow, even though all of the elements seem to be in place for the advent of the Antichrist, and I was listening to Carlos Pizarro being questioned about this, and the question was asked, and Carlos Pizarro went to answer it, and the YouTube channel froze up. And so finally, when they got it back a few minutes later, they lost the train of thought, and he never answered it. But the point is that I cannot help but think that God will first want to establish his plan in time, not only in eternity. And that is, Our Lady said that devotion to her Immaculate Heart would be placed alongside the devotion to the Sacred Heart, that the communions of reparations would have been established for the offenses against Our Lady's Immaculate Heart. And none of this at all has come about. So if the Antichrist were to come upon the scene, and even if Our Lady would be the instrument that God uses to crush his head, she hasn't in time been given what God wants of her. And I do believe that the fifth dogma of Our Lady's co-redemptrix will be officially declared, which will be part and parcel with this whole restoration of things. That's another thing, Our Lady's co-redemption, co-redeemer. We know, of course, without any doubt, that Jesus Christ is the sole redeemer of the universe, that he 100% redeemed us. And as you know, by co-redeemer, we mean that Our Lady cooperated in a most marvelous way by God's design, because our Lord would not have had his body to offer on Calvary if he had not received his body from Our Lady. That's the way he designed the plan. In his mind, from all eternity, the incarnation was inseparably linked to the yes, let it be done unto me according to your word of the Blessed Virgin. So Our Lady cooperated in a most exemplary manner. And Dr. Mark Marivalli has worked for years on this project, and he has done wonderful work. Here's again how sometimes the slightest little thing might help us to understand something more deeply. The Diamond Brothers are fascinating to listen to. They have marvelous documentation and information. They have a video on the dangers of magic, which is utterly fascinating. They prove that a lot of magic has overt demonic involvement in it. But I watched a 1.5 hour video where one of the Diamond Brothers was explaining how Our Lady should not be called co-redemptrix. And I can't help but think part of the reason for them thinking that was because John Paul II had used the term, and because they considered John Paul II to be almost an antichrist. Well, certainly anything he said in their mind cannot be true. But I'm thinking anyone who would deny Our Lady this title, which is interestingly also connected with Amsterdam, the apparitions of Our Lady Ida Perlman in Amsterdam, and also that by extension is related to Akita. I think heaven wants Our Lady to be honored as co-redemptrix. So the point I'm making here is, if they would deny Our Lady that title, to me, they discredit themselves across the board for everything else. Not to contradict what I said, we take what anyone says, we sift it, we accept what is good, we reject what is bad. But I don't think the Spirit of God would want to not deny Our Lady that special privilege. So again, for the end time scenario, it seems like a paradox because it is. How will it happen? When will it happen? We have to be in God's grace every minute of the day. But I think that this whole thing now is coming to a climax. And that's why I still hold out a certain expectation that 2029 might be pivotal, because Our Lady requested the consecration be made in 1929, and 100 years of 2029. And how interesting that the 2030 agenda is the year after. It all makes sense to me, but I can't see how it can happen except by a scenario similar to what was described earlier by that book, which speculated that whoever the Pope might be would be the Pope with a small remnant. How the papacy will be restored, I cannot imagine, but I can't help but think that's an essential component of the whole Fatima Enigma, that Our Lady is pointing out to us how the papacy is essential. If we're at the very end of time, then maybe that time would have passed. But my instinct is that God will allow a great restoration of the church, however that might take place. So I think that I have no idea how long I've been going on and on and on.
Oh, it's very good, Father. What I'd like to do is take a deeper dive into this over on Locals. I have a few questions, and I think we can maybe pull together some of the speculations and make it relevant to the world and our own devotional life. And so what I'd like to do is just wind this down. One last thing, I think I once heard too, with all that other evidence, somebody had done a cross-examination of some forensic dental comparisons, and maybe that was thrown into the mix as well. But there's so many other things.
I'm glad you mentioned that, though, because it's clear from this has all been addressed in these various studies, especially by Dr. Hanowski and Dr. Becerra. It's even if someone were to have all their teeth replaced, which was the case with Sister Lucy, it wouldn't affect the structure of their face. But Sister Lucy had all of her teeth extracted, I think Dr. Becerra said in the year 1946, because it was necessary. So it's not as if they would have had her teeth removed as a way of trying to camouflage her appearance. She had very bad teeth to start with, and perhaps they were becoming infected. So they were all removed around the time 1946, a few years before she entered the Carmel. But again, that is often used as a cop-out, saying, oh, well, of course her face looks different. She has new teeth. Well, we all know people who have had false teeth, and they look like the same person after their false teeth as they looked before.
That's how the story went, that I recall. So we're going to wind this segment down. Thank you, everybody, for joining us on Dr. Deep State. We're going to jump over to Locals and just dig into a couple details a little bit more. So thank you, everybody,